That laziness you hate yourself for? It's not laziness, it's your inner child, frozen in a moment of terror, still protecting you from dangers that no longer exist. Jung discovered that what we call laziness is often trauma in disguise, a child's brilliant survival strategy still running in an adult body. Every procrastination is a protection. Every avoidance is an old alarm. Every lazy behavior is a young part of you still trying to keep you safe the only way it knew how. Today, I'm going to show you why your laziness is actually loyalty. A child's loyalty to survival strategies that once saved you. And more importantly, how to heal that inner child so you can finally stop protecting yourself from a danger that ended decades ago. Jung understood something revolutionary about the psyche. We don't just have one age. Inside every adult lives every age they've ever been, especially the ages where they got stuck. And when trauma happens, a part of us freezes at that age, continuing to respond to the world as if we're still that terrified child. What looks like adult laziness is often a traumatized child's survival strategy. What seems like procrastination is often a young self still in freeze mode. What appears as lack of motivation is often a little one who learned that trying leads to pain. Jung called these frozen parts complexes, autonomous fragments of personality stuck in time. And until you heal these inner children, they'll keep protecting you in ways that look like self-sabotage but are actually self-preservation from a child's perspective. Your laziness started as intelligence, a child's brilliant adaptation to an impossible situation. Jung discovered that children faced with trauma don't just endure it, they adapt to it with remarkable creativity. If trying led to criticism, they learned not to try. If achievement brought danger, they learned to avoid achievement. If visibility meant pain, they learned to stay invisible. These weren't conscious decisions. They were survival instincts, as automatic as pulling your hand from flame. Think about it. If every time you showed excitement as a child, you were told to calm down, your psyche learned that enthusiasm is dangerous. Now, as an adult, what looks like lazy disinterest is actually a child protecting you from the danger of caring. If every achievement was met with "you could do better" or worse, jealousy and attack, your psyche learned that success brings pain. Now, what looks like lazy underachievement is actually a child protecting you from the danger of excellence. If every time you took initiative, you were punished for not doing it right, your psyche learned that action leads to shame. Now, what looks like lazy inaction is actually a child protecting you from the danger of trying. Jung saw this pattern constantly. Adults paralyzed by laziness, who were actually children paralyzed by old terror. The executive who couldn't finish projects, still the child whose father destroyed everything he created. The artist who couldn't start creating, still the child whose mother mocked every drawing. The student who couldn't study, still the child who was beaten for not being smart enough. The laziness wasn't a character flaw. It was a character adaptation. A young part of the psyche still following survival rules written in a different time. Jung had a patient, a brilliant woman who couldn't finish anything. She'd start projects with enthusiasm, then mysteriously lose all energy. Everyone, including her, called it laziness. But through analysis, they discovered the truth. As a child, whenever she accomplished something, her narcissistic mother would either claim credit or become depressed about being surpassed. The child learned, finishing things hurts mom. Success is betrayal. Achievement is abandonment. So she developed a brilliant strategy. Start things to feel alive, but never finish them to stay safe. What looked like adult laziness was actually a child's loyalty, still protecting the mother who needed her to fail. The moment she saw this, really saw it, everything changed. Not because she forced herself to be less lazy, but because she finally understood she wasn't lazy at all. She was traumatized. She was still being the good daughter who protected her mother by failing. This is the first recognition. Your laziness is not a moral failing. It's a child's brilliant solution to an impossible situation. You're not weak, you're still being strong in the way a child learned to be strong, through not doing, not trying, not finishing, not succeeding. But here's what's heartbreaking. The danger that child is protecting you from no longer exists. Your critical parent isn't here. Your unsafe environment is gone. Your childhood threats have passed. But the inner child doesn't know this. Time doesn't exist in the unconscious. That child is still protecting you from dangers that ended years or decades ago. You're like a soldier still fighting a war that ended long ago, still in the bunker, still on guard, not knowing peace was declared. Your laziness is that child soldier still at their post, still protecting you with the only strategy they had. What you call laziness, Jung would recognize as the freeze response, trauma's most misunderstood survival strategy. Fight and flight are obvious trauma responses. But freeze, the deer in headlights, the playing dead, the shutting down, this gets labeled as laziness, apathy, lack of motivation. Yet, freeze is just as much a survival response as running or fighting, sometimes more so. When a child can't fight back and can't run away, they freeze, they dissociate, they leave their body, they shut down. And if the trauma is chronic, freeze becomes their default mode. Even decades later, when faced with any stress, they freeze. That paralysis when you need to make a phone call, freeze. That inability to start the project, freeze. That hours of scrolling instead of doing, freeze. That fog that descends when you try to work, freeze. It's not laziness. It's your nervous system still responding to ordinary tasks as if they're existential threats. Jung understood that trauma doesn't just live in memory. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that bypass conscious thought. The traumatized inner child isn't just psychologically frozen. They're somatically frozen, stuck in a biological response that once saved their life. He observed patients whose laziness was clearly freeze response. They weren't choosing not to act. They were physiologically unable to act. Their bodies would literally shut down when faced with certain triggers. Heart rate would drop, breathing would shallow, mind would fog, energy would vanish. One patient described it perfectly. It's like someone pulls my plug. One moment I'm ready to work, the next I'm underwater, moving through thick honey, unable to think or move normally. Everyone thinks I'm lazy. I think I'm lazy. But it feels like something else is controlling my off switch. That something else was trauma, specifically childhood trauma that created a hair trigger freeze response. Any situation that even vaguely resembled the original trauma would flip the switch. And since the original trauma often involved normal daily activities, doing homework while father raged, cleaning while mother criticized, existing while feeling unsafe, almost everything could trigger freeze. Jung discovered that healing freeze requires understanding it as a young survival strategy, not an adult choice. You don't shame a deer for freezing in headlights. You don't call a child weak for playing dead when threatened. So, why do we shame ourselves for freeze responses that saved us? The inner child learned, when you can't fight and can't flee, you freeze. Become invisible, disappear into yourself. Make yourself small, still, absent. It's not giving up, it's waiting for danger to pass. But here's the tragedy. For the traumatized child, danger never fully passed. There was always another criticism, another threat, another unsafe moment coming. So, freeze became not a temporary response, but a way of life. The child learned to live in permanent semi-freeze, never fully present, never fully engaged, always ready to disappear. Now, as an adult, you're still in semi-freeze. What looks like laziness is actually a constant state of biological shutdown. You're not unmotivated, you're frozen. You're not procrastinating, you're dissociated. You're not lazy, you're still playing dead, waiting for a danger to pass that passed long ago. Jung's approach to healing freeze wasn't to force action. That just reinforces the trauma. It was to slowly, gently, compassionately thaw the frozen child, to create enough safety that the nervous system could finally switch off its alarm, to let the inner child know, through experience not words, that the danger has passed. Here's the paradox Jung discovered. Sometimes laziness isn't about trauma making you freeze. It's about trauma never letting you truly rest. Some children learn that rest is dangerous, that stopping means criticism, that relaxing brings attack, that being unproductive makes you worthless. So they develop a specific trauma response, the inability to genuinely rest. What looks like laziness, lying in bed, avoiding tasks, endless distraction, isn't rest. It's anxious paralysis. It's guilty non-doing. It's the child who was never allowed to rest, still unable to rest, caught between exhaustion and the fear of stopping. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. Adults who seemed lazy were actually in a constant state of stressed non-rest. They weren't relaxing, they were collapsed. They weren't choosing leisure. They were frozen between the need to rest and the trauma of resting. Think about your lazy times. Are you actually resting? Or are you scrolling anxiously, mind racing with guilt, body tense with shame about not being productive? That's not laziness. That's a traumatized child who learned that rest is dangerous, but exhaustion is unbearable. The child who had to be on constantly, performing, achieving, pleasing, never learned how to genuinely rest. Rest meant disappointment. Rest meant abandonment. Rest meant you're worthless. So, even when exhausted to collapse, the child couldn't truly rest. Now, as an adult, you're caught in a tragic loop, too exhausted to function, too traumatized to rest. So, you exist in a liminal space that looks like laziness, but is actually a kind of purgatory, neither working nor resting, neither productive nor peaceful. Jung had a patient who spent entire days in bed, accomplishing nothing, labeled lazy by everyone including himself. But Jung noticed something. The man was exhausted even after days of rest. He wasn't lazy. He was unable to rest. Through analysis, they discovered that, as a child, the patient was only valued for achievement. The moment he stopped producing good grades, good behavior, good performance, he became invisible, worthless. Love was contingent on constant output. So the child learned, you're only worthy when producing. Rest equals worthlessness. But human beings need rest. So he developed a compromise, collapse into exhausted non-productivity while mentally flogging himself with guilt. He couldn't work because he was exhausted. He couldn't rest because rest meant annihilation. What looked like laziness was actually a child caught between two impossible options: work yourself to death or rest and become worthless. The laziness was the psyche's attempt to find a third option, non-productive collapse that wasn't quite rest, but wasn't quite work. Healing this pattern required Jung to help the patient experience something the child never had: unconditional worth during rest. The radical experience of being valued while producing nothing. The revolutionary feeling of being loved while achieving nothing. This is the second recognition. Your laziness might not be inability to work. It might be inability to rest. The traumatized child inside doesn't need to be more productive. They need to learn that rest doesn't equal worthlessness, that stopping doesn't mean abandonment, that you're valuable even when you're producing nothing. This isn't inner child work as it's often taught, visualizing your child self and having imaginary conversations. Jung's approach was far more profound, actually experiencing yourself as that child, feeling what they felt, but with adult consciousness holding the experience. He discovered that intellectual understanding doesn't heal trauma. You can know exactly why you're lazy, understand perfectly how trauma created it, and still be frozen. Because trauma doesn't live in the intellectual mind. It lives in the body, the nervous system, the implicit memory, the felt sense. Healing requires what Jung called living through, actually experiencing the frozen feelings, the stuck energy, the incomplete responses, but with consciousness, not re-traumatizing yourself, but finally completing what couldn't be completed then. The child who couldn't fight back needs to feel their rage safely, consciously, with an adult self that can contain it. The child who couldn't run needs to feel their urge to flee and know they can leave now. They have legs that work, doors they can walk through. The child who froze needs to slowly, gently thaw, to feel sensation return, movement become possible, presence becomes safe. Jung did this work himself. During his confrontation with the unconscious, he literally played like a child, building blocks, making sand castles, playing with stones, not symbolically, but actually. His adult self creating space for his child self to exist, play, express. He wrote, "The small boy is still around and possesses a creative life which I lack, but how can I make my way to it?" His answer was direct engagement, not thinking about the inner child, but being the inner child, with adult consciousness as the container, letting the frozen parts thaw in the warmth of adult understanding. One technique Jung used was what he called active imagination with the child. You don't just visualize your child's self, you embody them. You sit how they sat. You feel what they felt. You let their words come through your mouth. You become the child, but with your adult self as witness and container. A patient did this with her lazy pattern. She embodied the frozen 7-year-old who learned that trying meant failing, meant abandonment. She felt the terror in her body, the shutdown in her nervous system, the freeze response taking over. But this time, her adult consciousness was present too, holding the child, saying what no one said then. It's okay to fail. You won't be abandoned. You're safe to try. I'm here no matter what happens. The child inside began to thaw. Not immediately. Thawing takes time. But slowly the freeze response loosened. The laziness revealed itself as frozen terror, and the terror, finally felt and held, began to transform into tears, then anger, then grief, then, finally, freedom. The final key to healing laziness trauma. Giving your inner child permission they never received. Jung discovered that traumatized children are often frozen in time, waiting for permission that never came. Permission to rest. Permission to fail. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to exist without producing. Permission to be loved without earning. Your laziness might be that child, still waiting, still hoping someone will finally say, "You don't have to earn your existence. You're valuable as you are. You can rest without guilt. You can fail without abandonment. You can be imperfect and still be loved." But here's the profound realization. The permission can't come from outside anymore. It has to come from you. You have to become the adult who gives your inner child the permission they're still waiting for. Jung understood this was the essence of individuation, becoming your own parent, your own authority, your own source of permission, not waiting for the world to heal your inner child, but becoming the healer yourself. This means literally, not metaphorically, giving yourself permission. Permission to rest without guilt. Permission to fail without shame. Permission to be unproductive without worthlessness. Permission to exist without earning. Permission to be loved without performing. Jung had patients write literal permission slips to their inner children. I give you permission to rest. I give you permission to fail. I give you permission to be ordinary. Not affirmations, actual permissions, as real as any adult authority could grant. One patient, frozen in procrastination, wrote, I give little Sarah permission to make mistakes. She is allowed to try and fail. She is safe even when she fails. She is loved even when she produces nothing. She has permission to exist without earning her existence. She read it daily, not to her adult self, but to the child inside who was still waiting for permission to try without guarantee of success. Slowly, the paralysis lifted, not because she became less lazy, but because the child inside finally had permission to act without perfection. This is the healing. Your inner child isn't lazy. They're traumatized. They're frozen in old terror. They're protecting you with outdated strategies. They're waiting for permission that never came. Your job isn't to overcome them, discipline them, or force them to be productive. Your job is to love them, thaw them, give them permission, show them safety, and let them know, through patient, consistent experience, that the danger has passed. When you understand that laziness is trauma, everything changes. You stop fighting yourself and start healing yourself. You stop forcing productivity and start creating safety. You stop shaming the child and start parenting them. Jung knew that healing the inner child wasn't quick work. Trauma patterns developed over years don't dissolve overnight. The freeze response learned in childhood doesn't immediately thaw. The child waiting for permission doesn't immediately trust it. But with patience, consciousness, and compassion, the frozen child begins to move. The paralyzed parts start to flow. The laziness reveals itself as the trauma it always was. And trauma, once conscious and held with love, transforms. You're not lazy, you never were. You're a child's brilliant survival strategy still running in an adult body. You're yesterday's adaptation to danger, still protecting against today's safety. You're frozen in time, waiting for permission to thaw. If you've been calling yourself lazy, stop. Now, that's not what's happening. You're traumatized. You're frozen. You're still protecting yourself with a child's limited strategies. You're waiting for permission that needs to come from you. You're unable to rest, not unwilling to work. The healing doesn't come through discipline, willpower, or forcing yourself to be productive. It comes through recognizing the traumatized child inside, thanking them for protecting you, and slowly showing them that the danger has passed. Most people will never make this connection. They'll spend their lives fighting their laziness, never recognizing it as trauma. They'll shame the very parts of themselves that most need love. But you, if you recognize yourself in these words, you now know the truth. You're not lazy, you're traumatized. And trauma can heal. If you're ready to heal your inner child and transform what you've been calling laziness, subscribe for more Jungian psychology. And to understand complex trauma more deeply, click the video on your screen now. Remember Jung's words. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Your laziness is part of that complete self, not as a flaw to fix, but as a child to heal, a trauma to transform, a frozen part to thaw with love. You're not lazy. You never were. You're just still protecting yourself from dangers that ended long ago. It's safe to stop protecting now. It's safe to thaw.